I wasn't supposed to be inside that room. Not because anyone told me to leave. Nobody did. I stood there in the archive corridor of the Royal Collection Trust, notepad in hand, a press lanyard around my neck that felt like it belonged to someone more qualified, and I understood, in the slow way you understand things that are too large for one thought, that I was looking at something money genuinely could not explain. That's what I want to tell you about. Not the price tags. Not the auction estimates. Those numbers exist, sure. Christie's has opinions. Sotheby's has opinions. But none of those people were standing where I was standing that Tuesday morning in early spring when the light came through a side window at exactly the angle that made everything in that room look like it was already a memory. Let me back up. I'd been given access, limited, supervised, 3 hours maximum, to document a small portion of the objects associated with William and Catherine's private collection. Not the crown jewels. Not the staterooms. The personal pieces. The things that travel with them. The things that sit on shelves in Kensington Palace Apartments and Adelaide Cottage and wherever else they call home in any given season. My escort was a woman named Margaret. She'd worked for the Royal Collection for 22 years. Grey blazer. Sensible shoes. She had the energy of someone who had personally rewrapped half the British Empire in acid-free tissue paper, which, honestly, she probably had. She didn't explain things the way a museum docent would. She didn't say, and here we have, she just paused near certain objects, and the pause itself was the explanation. You felt her weight shift. That was how you knew something mattered. We stopped near a display case that held, among other items, a small writing desk set. Modest, by royal standards. Dark walnut. A few inkwells, a pen tray, a letter seal. The kind of thing that would sit unremarkably in a country house antique shop in the Cotswolds. Except. That desk set, Margaret said, her voice doing that particular thing where it drops but doesn't go quiet, belonged to Diana. She let the sentence sit there. I wrote nothing in my notepad. I just looked. The desk set had been kept by William. Not displayed. Kept. There's a difference, and the difference is the whole point. Displayed things exist for the world. Kept things exist for the person. At some stage, nobody told me precisely when, and I didn't ask, Catherine had placed a single stem of dried lavender across the pen tray. Purple-gray, brittle, still faintly present in the way that dried lavender always is, as though it refuses complete disappearance. She didn't document it. Didn't frame it. Didn't explain it. Just left it there. That is the first treasure. Not the desk. The lavender. The desk is worth something. The Royal Collection's assessors have their figures. But, the lavender, that is the object that does the work no figure can do. It says, someone in this house is still tending to a grief that never fully closed. It says it without saying it. It says it the way women who are deeply, quietly loving tend to say the most important things, sideways, through small gestures, deniably, in ways that only land if you're paying the right kind of attention. I stood there longer than was probably appropriate. Margaret didn't rush me. The second piece I want to tell you about isn't an heirloom. It isn't historic. It has no provenance that would interest an archivist or evaluation team. It is a hand-painted ceramic mug. Chipped on the handle. Badly glazed. The kind of thing a child makes in a pottery class when they are too young to know that lopsided is a problem. George made it. He was 5, or thereabouts. The painting on the side, and I use painting in the most generous possible sense, depicts what appears to be a football. Or possibly a sun. Possibly a dog. The ambiguity is complete and magnificent. William uses it. Not for guests. Not for display. For his morning tea. This information came to me secondhand, from a household staffer who offered it the way people offer things they find quietly moving, with a small, almost embarrassed smile, like they weren't sure they should find it as touching as they did. The man who will one day be King of England drinks his morning tea from a lopsided ceramic mug with a questionable painting on the side because his son made it with his hands. The mug costs nothing. It costs nothing in the way that only the most valuable things can afford to. You want to understand William and Catherine, and, I mean actually understand them, past the photographs and the way from the carriage steps and the carefully managed media moments, you have to start with the objects they chose to keep rather than the ones they were given. Any royal is given extraordinary things. Extraordinary things arrive constantly. Faberge eggs and first editions and caskets of jewels from visiting heads of state and watercolors by long-dead masters and ceremonial swords and silk robes and objects so laden with history that touching them feels like a minor act of trespass. Most of those things go to the collection. Properly housed. Properly tagged. Properly managed. The things on William's actual shelves, on Catherine's actual dressing table, on the windowsill of their actual kitchen, those things tell a different story. And it is that story I spent 3 hours trying to read. Margaret walked me past a framed photograph that I wasn't supposed to linger on, because it was personal and not part of the approved access. I saw it for maybe 4 seconds. It was not an official portrait. It was Catherine recognizably her, but disheveled in the best possible way, hair undone, laughing at something off camera, holding what appeared to be a very muddy Wellington boot and looking at it with an expression of pure, helpless exasperation. No frame. Old clip frame, the cheap kind. The kind you buy at a high street stationery shop. The photograph was sitting on a bookshelf between what looked like a well-worn paperback and a small painted stone. The painted stone was the size of a fist. On it, in a child's handwriting, were the words, "Dada King." Lewis made that. Someone told me later, unprompted. He'd made it when he was 4, the week William was investitured as Prince of Wales, because he'd decided his father needed a commemorative rock. Dada King. In red paint. Slightly smeared. On a bookshelf in the private apartment of the future King of England. Sitting right next to his paperback like it was the most natural place in the world. I left the archive building that afternoon and walked for a while without particular direction, which is something I do when I've seen something I need to metabolize slowly. The street outside was doing what London streets do in early spring, half committed to the season, still cold enough to keep your coat on, just warm enough to notice the crocuses. People walked past with the urgent purposefulness of people who have actual places to be. I thought about the lavender. I thought about the ceramic mug. I thought about Dada King, sitting on a shelf like it was the only title in the room that actually mattered. And, I thought, the costliest treasure they hold isn't in any collection. It isn't insured. It doesn't appear in any inventory that a future monarch's household staff will be asked to maintain. It's the version of themselves they've managed to keep ordinary. In the circumstances they occupy, the weight of history, the permanence of public gaze, the institutional enormity of what they represent, choosing to drink from a lopsided mug is not a small thing. It is, quietly, a form of resistance. And it costs everything to maintain. The auction house sent their man on a Wednesday. This was years ago now, before the move to Windsor, before the illness, before the particular reshaping of things that recent years have brought. A junior valuation specialist. Nice enough fellow. Young. The kind of young that still believes expertise is mostly about knowing the right things rather than knowing which things to not say. He'd been brought in to assess certain items in a secondary storage space, not the principal rooms, not the curated spaces, just a kind of overflow situation, the domestic archaeology that accumulates in any household that has existed long enough and received enough gifts that nobody quite knows where to put everything. He came back with his report. His supervisor read it, went quiet for a moment, and then, apparently said something along the lines of, "Some of these values are wrong." The junior specialist defended his figures. They were accurate. They were market appropriate. His supervisor said, "I don't mean the numbers are wrong. I mean you valued the wrong things." I heard this story from someone who heard it from someone else, which means it has probably softened at the edges and sharpened at the center in the way that second-hand stories always do. But the kernel of it felt true enough to stay with me. Because there is a valuation problem at the heart of any attempt to explain what William and Catherine actually treasure. The problem is this: the objects that carry the most weight in their lives are exactly the objects that no professional assessor would flag. A professional assessor is looking for provenance. age, maker's marks, rarity, condition. None of those criteria apply to what I want to tell you about next. Catherine keeps a garden journal. Not a design journal, not the kind with embossed covers that gets gifted at Christmas and sits unused. A plain, spiral-bound notebook, the kind with the black marbled cover. She's been keeping it since before the children were born. Possibly longer. In it, she tracks what she plants, when she plants it, what survives and what doesn't. She sketches, and she can draw, actually draw, in the careful observational way of someone trained to look closely. Botanical detail. The particular shape of a leaf. The stages of something growing. She also writes notes to herself that have nothing to do with gardening. Nobody has read these. Nobody is meant to. The journal isn't a public document and it never will be. I mention it only because its existence is the point, because a woman of her profile, under her level of scrutiny, making herself a private space that is entirely hers and entirely unobserved, that is not a small act. That is a daily practice of self-possession in a life that has very little room for it. The journal costs approximately £2.50. It is probably the most fiercely guarded thing she owns. Now let me tell you about the photograph. Not the clip frame one I glimpsed in part 1. A different photograph. This one I know about through a slightly more direct channel, a journalist colleague who attended a private briefing years ago and came back with this detail lodged in her memory like a splinter, because it was the kind of thing you can't unhear once you've heard it. The photograph is of William and Catherine on their honeymoon. Not a formal portrait. Not a sanctioned image. A photograph taken by neither of them, by a friend who was present on one of the early days, somewhere private, somewhere coastal. William is looking at Catherine. Catherine is looking at something outside the frame. She's laughing. He doesn't know the camera is on him. That's the whole photograph. His face, unguarded, looking at her. They keep it in their bedroom. Not in a silver frame with the royal cipher. In a plain wooden frame, slightly sun-bleached at the edges. The kind that implies it has lived near a window for a long time. My colleague, when she told me this, paused the way people pause when they've said something that moved them more than they intended. Then, she said, I think that photograph is probably worth more to him than anything in the entire royal collection. Which is saying something, because the royal collection has a Vermeer. This is the thing about the treasures they hold that no inventory captures. They are not passive collectors. They are not people who receive extraordinary things and store them. They are people who, within the machinery of an institution that has operated for 1,000 years and intends to operate for 1,000 more, have somehow managed to build a life. A real one. With a mug that drips on one side and a lopsided football sundog painted in a school pottery class and a journal that nobody reads and a photograph of a man who didn't know he was being watched, looking at the person who changed the entire shape of his existence. I want to tell you about one more object, because it is perhaps the strangest of all in terms of what it represents. It is a piece of sea glass. Pale green. Smoothed to opacity by decades of ocean work. The size of a large coin. William found it on a beach in Norfolk when he was a child. He kept it in his school trouser pocket for an entire term, long enough that the lining wore thin around it, and then he transferred it to a small wooden box that has traveled with him ever since. Eton. St. Andrews. RAF training. Afghanistan. Every official residence. The box itself is nothing. The glass is nothing. Together they are the entire record of a boy who needed something to hold on to. Catherine knows about it. She's never asked to see inside the box, according to the person who told me this. She simply knows it exists, and that is enough. That is, in its own quiet way, one of the most loving things I have heard about their marriage. The recognition that some things are not yours to open. That the person you love most is allowed to carry something you will never fully see. The light was going by the time I finished my research notes that second day. I was sitting in a cafe near the Strand, bad coffee, good enough chair, watching the street go grey and orange with the particular early evening London quality that always makes everything look like a film about to happen. I had filled most of a notebook. Then, I went back through it and crossed out everything that felt like it was reaching. Everything that was trying too hard. Everything that explained what didn't need explaining. What I was left with was mostly this: the costliest treasures are the ones that can't be replicated. Not because of rarity in the collector's sense. Because of irreversibility. You cannot remake a moment. You cannot unfind the sea glass. You cannot regrow the child who made the mug or retake the photograph that caught a man looking at a woman like she was the most astonishing thing he'd ever encountered. Those objects hold time in them. And no valuation system on earth has a column for that. There is a particular quality of silence in rooms where important things have happened. Not a dramatic silence. Not the held breath kind. Just a kind of density, as though the air has absorbed enough of human life that it weighs slightly more than ordinary air. You notice it in old libraries. In the back pews of very old churches. In hospital waiting rooms after the waiting is over. I noticed it in a corridor at Windsor. I was there for a legitimate reason. I've said that before, I'll say it again, because I'm aware this story keeps depositing me in places I probably shouldn't romanticize too heavily. I was there. I was walking. I turned a corner. And, there, on a side table that looked like it had been placed there by someone with no particular intention, just a surface, just a place to put things, was a children's drawing. Charlotte's, I was told afterward. She'd done it at school and brought it home, and William had carried it into the building in his jacket pocket, apparently, and it had ended up on the table because he'd emptied his pockets and hadn't quite decided what to do with it yet. The drawing was of a horse. At least, it was labeled horse in careful, newly confident capital letters, which is how I know it was a horse, because otherwise it could have been several things. It was on the side table of a corridor that also contained, within my sightline, an oil portrait of George III. George III. The drawing of the horse. Same corridor. I don't have a clean metaphor for that. I don't think it needs one. Some things mean exactly what they are. Let me tell you about the ring. Not the engagement ring that's been documented to an exhausting degree, the sapphire, Diana's ring, the symbolism that has been analyzed by people more qualified and more breathless than me. You know about that ring. Everyone knows about that ring. I want to tell you about Catherine's other ring. She wears it on her right hand. Gold, simple band, almost plain enough to be overlooked. She's worn it consistently since before the wedding. Nobody asks about it in the press, presumably because it photographs as nothing, no stone, no obvious history, no visual hook. It was her grandmother's. Phyllis Middleton. A woman who, by all accounts, worked hard and loved fiercely and understood that the purpose of family was not to produce impressive people but to produce sturdy ones. The ring passed down through the family in the unannounced way that certain things pass, not as an official bequest, not with ceremony, but simply as the natural trajectory of something that was always going to land where it landed. Catherine wears it to public engagements. She wore it to the coronation. She wore it through chemotherapy. The ring costs, objectively, very little. The gold is not exceptional. The design is not remarkable. No auction house would give it a dedicated lot. It is worth everything. Not because of what it is. Because of who it remembers. Because Catherine is a woman who knows exactly where she comes from and chose, in the middle of the most gilded life in the kingdom, to keep that knowledge on her right hand where she could see it every time she reached for something. I want to be honest with you about something. I've been building a certain picture here of two people who are, despite their circumstances, essentially human in the ways that matter. And I believe that picture. I believe everything I've told you. But I also want to be honest about the fact that their life is not ordinary in any way that we should be sentimental about. The weight they carry is real. The institution they serve is ancient and demanding and has, historically, not been gentle with the people it requires. There are no days off. There is no version of Tuesday where nobody is watching. Every room they walk into has been adjusted in advance. Every public sadness has a communications strategy around it. Every private grief eventually becomes a public narrative whether they choose it or not. And, in that context, in the permanent fishbowl of it, the relentlessness, the way even their children's drawings end up being glimpsed by people like me, the objects I've been describing take on a different quality. They're not just treasures. They are anchors. The mug that drips on one side. The sea glass in the wooden box. The plain gold ring. The garden journal nobody reads. The photograph of a man who didn't know he was being seen. These things hold them to something underneath the institution. Something that was there before the titles and will still be there in whatever form when the weight of those titles has done what weight does to a person over time. I spoke, near the end of my research, to a woman who has worked in and around royal households for the better part of 3 decades. Not a senior figure. Not someone whose name appears on anything official. Someone whose job is largely invisible and whose observations are, for that reason, probably the most reliable I encountered. I asked her what surprised her most about William and Catherine, given everything she'd seen. She was quiet for a long time. Not the kind of quiet that means she's thinking. The kind that means she already knows and is deciding whether to say it. Then, she said, they laugh at the same things. She didn't elaborate. She moved on to something else. I've been thinking about it since. Because of everything I'd spent weeks researching, the objects, the histories, the objects within histories, the layers and significances, they laugh at the same things was the one piece of information that landed like a stone dropping into still water. After everything. After the grief and the scrutiny and the institution and the illness and the weight of the crown they are walking slowly toward, they laugh at the same things. The horse drawing, I found out later, was moved from the corridor table to William's study. It now lives on the bookshelf. Next to Daddy King. I was back on a train out of London as the last daylight went. Fields going dark past the window. The kind of end-of-day exhaustion that is mostly satisfaction with a thin layer of melancholy over the top of it. I'd spent weeks trying to understand what the costliest treasures were. What the answer meant. How to explain a truth that doesn't reduce to numbers or provenance or square footage or carat weight. And I kept coming back to the same thing, the costliest treasure they hold is this. They have not lost each other inside it. The institution takes. It always takes. History is full of people who gave everything to the crown and had nothing left over. Nothing for the morning. Nothing for the person sleeping next to them. Nothing that was just theirs, untranslatable, unscheduled, alive. William and Catherine have somehow, imperfectly, through choices you can see only if you look at the right objects, held onto something. A mug. A ring. A piece of sea glass. A photograph of a man falling in love without knowing he was being watched. The costliest treasures aren't the ones the insurance companies know about. They're the ones that nobody could replace. A note on sourcing: certain details in this account were gathered through supervised access, secondhand testimony, and the kind of careful attention that people in long service rarely get credit for offering. Some specifics have been compressed or reconstructed from multiple sources. The emotional truth of what is described is not in dispute.